War is often described in terms of armies, strategies, and leaders, yet beneath every movement of troops and every blast of artillery lies something older, deeper, and more enduring than any human conflict: the land itself. During the First World War, the Earth was not merely the stage upon which events unfolded. It was pulled into the war as an unwilling participant. Forests, fields, rivers, coasts, mountains, and farmland became victims, weapons, obstacles, and memories all at once. The landscape absorbed the violence and reflected it back in altered forms that would remain long after the guns fell silent. The Great War reshaped the physical world as profoundly as it reshaped societies. Hills were sliced open, valleys drowned in water and mud, forests reduced to skeletons, and farmland turned into wasteland. Roads carved new scars across peaceful countryside, while trenches bit their way into soil that had once grown wheat, vineyards, orchards, and small gardens behind cottages and farmhouses. Even distant landscapes, far from battlefields, felt the pull of industry, extraction, and expansion needed to feed the machinery of war. This story is not about generals or battle maps. It is about the land beneath their decisions, and how the First World War changed the shape of the earth. Before 1914, Europe's landscapes were mosaics of habit and memory. Fields followed ancient patterns shaped by generations of farmers. Vineyards climbed slopes in careful rows. Forests stretched across hills and valleys, filled with pathways cut by shepherds, hunters, and woodcutters. Rivers turned water wheels, carried barges, and reflected bridges that connected villages to towns. Even battlefields of past centuries had softened into peaceful meadows and quiet plains. Nature and human life existed in close cooperation. The rhythm of seasons guided work, rest, and community life. Autumn harvests, winter firewood, spring planting, and summer grazing formed a pattern older than nations themselves. When war arrived, that rhythm fractured. The land that had fed, sheltered, and guided people was suddenly dragged into a purpose it had never known. The most recognizable landscape of the First World War was the trench. It did not appear all at once, nor was it part of the original plans. At first, both sides expected movement, swift campaigns, decisive advances, victories measured in miles rather than meters. But when armies collided and neither side collapsed, soldiers dug in. Temporary ditches became permanent positions. Shallow shelters deepened into complex networks. The earth, once shaped for farming, was now reshaped for survival. Layers of soil were peeled away to carve zigzagging lines across fields. Trenches followed contours of land not for beauty or efficiency, but for protection against enemy fire. What had once been open countryside turned into a maze of ditches, dugouts, parapets, and mud-filled gullies. The terrain was no longer open space. It became a geography of confinement. The land remembered every blow of a shovel. Roots were torn from soil. Stones were hauled and stacked. Water collected in hollows, refusing to drain because the digging had disrupted natural flow. Clay, sand, chalk, and peat, each type of soil reacted differently, creating landscapes of crumbling walls, collapsing ledges, or flooded pits. What had once been living ground became layered with sandbags, timber, iron, and wire. Trenches were not only scars in the earth, they were wounds that would take decades to heal. Artillery transformed landscapes more violently than any plow or storm. Explosions lifted soil into the air and threw it back down in fractured pieces. Hills flattened, forests disappeared, and valleys filled with debris. Fields that had once shown the curved lines of farmers' furrows became pocked with craters. Shell holes formed irregular ponds where water gathered, unable to drain through compacted, churned ground. These pools reflected broken tree stumps and shattered roots, turning the land into a patchwork of stagnant water and exposed earth. Entire forests vanished. Trees that had stood for centuries were snapped like matchsticks, stripped of branches, and left as splintered poles against gray skies. Roots protruded through open ground, no longer anchored in soil that had been blasted away. Animals fled, leaving behind silence and emptiness where birds once sang and leaves rustled in the wind. The land stopped behaving like land. It no longer grew crops, supported trees, or offered stable ground to walk on. It became unstable, fragile, and unpredictable, a sort of physical memory of destruction that reshaped daily experience. The war altered more than soil. It changed the path of water. Trench systems and shell craters disrupted drainage patterns that had guided rainwater for generations. Streams overflowed into trenches, forming sticky, stagnant pools. Ditches overflowed and merged with trenches, turning defensive lines into shallow canals. Fields that once absorbed rainfall became swamps under constant bombardment. In some regions, armies deliberately flooded land to create barriers against advances. Fields were opened to rivers, marshes widened, and lowlands drowned beneath rising water. What had once been fertile farmland became deliberate obstacles, new, temporary lakes with jagged shorelines shaped by military strategy rather than nature. Water, like the land, had been conscripted into the war. Away from the front lines, landscapes changed in different but equally powerful ways. New factories rose near coal mines, forests, and railways. Quarries deepened as stone and gravel were extracted for fortifications, roads, and runways. Hillsides disappeared as excavation intensified. Forests were felled to build ships, crates, barracks, and supports for trench walls. Railway lines multiplied across plains and valleys, carving new routes into countryside that had once known only footpaths and cart tracks. Roads widened to support trucks and artillery wagons. Bridges expanded, and tunnels were blasted through mountains to feed the needs of war. Rural landscapes that had changed little over centuries suddenly transformed within months. Villages expanded into depots. Open fields turned into training camps. Quiet coastlines filled with shipyards, docks, and naval installations. The land was reorganized for efficiency rather than tradition. Even untouched landscapes felt the weight of extraction. Coal fields deepened, forests receded, and farmland expanded under pressure to feed armies and civilians alike. The ground gave up more of its resources than ever before. The war's landscapes were not limited to muddy plains and shattered forests. In mountain ranges, soldiers carved paths into rock and ice. Snowfields were cut by trenches, and ridgelines were blasted into unnatural shapes. Avalanches, triggered by gunfire, reshaped slopes and buried entire positions beneath sudden cascades of stone and snow. In deserts, armies altered sand and scrubland through roads, wells, and supply routes. Tracks cut across dunes. Oases became military way stations. The dry earth bore the marks of wheels and hooves long after they passed. New routes that reshaped traditional travel patterns. Each environment was pushed beyond its natural pace of change. The war accelerated geography, forcing landscapes to evolve in months rather than centuries. When the war ended, the land did not immediately recover. Trenches collapsed slowly, turning into shallow depressions. Craters became ponds or grassy hollows. Rusted wire and metal lay buried beneath layers of soil. Forests regrew, but in new formations, uneven and fragmented. Fields were plowed again, yet farmers struck metal with every season's work. Some landscapes refused to hide what had happened. Lines of trenches could still be traced beneath new grass. Shell craters formed patterns visible from the sky. Abandoned bunkers stood like fossils of a violent age. Even where forests returned, their roots wrapped themselves around fragments of iron and stone left from the war. The land held memory in silence. It remembered every blast, every trench, every place where the earth had opened and swallowed the past. It remembered how humans had asked it to bear the weight of destruction, and how it had done so without choice, without voice, but not without consequence. The Great War ended, but the land that survived it was not the same land that existed before. The earth itself carried the story.